Good evening, everyone. My name is Emily Underwood. I work in community engagement at the Missouri Historical Society. And on behalf of MHS, I'd like to welcome you to STL History Live and thank you for joining us virtually this evening. We begin by acknowledging that we here in St. Louis are on the ancestral lands of the Osage Nation, Missouria, and Illinois Confederacy, who were removed unjustly, and that we in this community are the beneficiaries of that removal. We honor them as we live, work, and study here. At the Missouri Historical Society, safety is a top priority, so nearly all of our programming is virtual right now, but the museum is open Wednesday through Sunday with several safety precautions in place, so we would love for you to visit if you feel safe. Advanced reservations are required to visit all of the Missouri Historical Society locations. That includes the museum, as well as the Soldiers Memorial Military Museum and our Library and Research Center. And you can visit mohistory.org to reserve your free tickets. Tonight's program, The Women's Suffrage Movement with Dr. Sally Resch Wagner, is inspired by the latest exhibit at the Missouri History Museum, which is called Beyond the Ballot, St. Louis and Suffrage, presented by Wells Fargo. In addition to placing St. Louis in the story of the suffrage movement, it also highlights 32 local women who played a significant role in making change in our area even before they had the vote. And I want to thank again Wells Fargo for their support of the exhibit, as well as Emerson, who is our education sponsor, and the Women's Foundation of Greater St. Louis, which is sponsoring the Movements and Moments series that includes this evening's program. I also want to thank all of the Missouri Historical Society members who are tuned in tonight. We certainly are grateful and appreciative of your support. If you aren't a member yet, we would love you to, we would consider joining, and I will be posting a link where you can get more information about membership in the chat in just a little bit. I also want to thank all of you who are in the St. Louis City and County region for your tax contributions through the Zoo Museum Tax District. Before we get started, I just want to go over a few things you'll want to know. This is going to be roughly a 30-minute program, and then we'll have another 30 minutes or so for Q&A. So please feel free to submit your questions through the Q&A button that you'll find down at the bottom of your screen in the toolbar. And we'll do our best to get to as many of those questions as we can. Also, tonight's presentation is being recorded, so if you'd like to view it again or share it with anyone else, you can look for it on the Missouri Historical Society YouTube channel. And that should show up sometime early next week. And finally, your feedback is always important to us, so we are asking you to take just a minute or two at the end of the program tonight to answer some questions on a survey that's going to pop up in a separate tab on your browser, so you can look for that at the end of the evening. Tonight's program is about honoring women and their stories, and before we begin the presentation with Dr. Wagner, we would like to take a moment to honor the memory of two women who have meant so much to the Missouri Historical Society. And so at this time, I'm going to turn the screen over to Dr. Frances Levine, who is the Missouri Historical Society president, to share a few words with you. Dr. Levine.
Thank you so much, Emily, and thank you, Dr. Wagner, for ceding a few minutes of your time while we honor the memory of Kathy Burgess and Elizabeth Robb. When you come to see the exhibit, Beyond the Ballot, I think you'll notice that it honors women who made contributions to this community in so many ways, by being teachers, by being activists, by being involved in the care of our community in so many ways. And we have worked on the staff with Kathy Burgess and Elizabeth Robb for a long time. We lost both of them during the last several months, not to COVID, but to other illnesses. And the staff has felt so much their loss, and we wanted to do something to honor them. And so I'd like to tell you just a little bit. Elizabeth Robb passed away on August 28th, and she had served on the Missouri Historical Society board since 1997. She was always prepared. She was an active participant in our board meetings. And most of all, she came to all of our programs. She hardly ever missed a program. And she chaired a lot of committees. She chaired our Education and Visitor Experience Committee. She chaired our Collections Committee. But whatever she did, she'd say her committee was the best and was contributing the most. And she was loved, absolutely loved. She was committed to community service. In addition to our board, she served at Webster University, the Clayton Child Care Center, the Clayton Chamber of Commerce, the St. Louis Cathedral Concerts, and the Bach Society. Even as Elizabeth faced her untimely death, whenever you saw her and asked her how it was, she'd say, "I'm fantastic, life is good." So Elizabeth, we know you would have been with us tonight, and so here's to your memory. Our other board member who we're honoring tonight is Catherine Burgess. Kathy died on May 14th, and she was passionate about St. Louis. She was passionate about making St. Louis a better place. She joined the Missouri Historical Society in 1992 as to our Friends Board. She served as that Friends Board leadership in 2008 and 2009. She had served on the Board of Trustees since 2010. She and her husband, Jim, are so committed to making St. Louis a better place to live, to work, to play, to invest. She served as the chair of our 150th anniversary, and her death is another great loss to the community. So when you go through the exhibit and you think about the women who have made St. Louis, think a little about Elizabeth and Kathy, because they've helped us as well. So thank you so much, Dr. Wagner, for letting me steal a minute or two of your time. And I'm going to send this back to Emily to walk us through the program tonight and to introduce Dr. Wagner. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fran. Appreciate those kind words and about two remarkable women. And at this time, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker for the evening, Dr. Sally Resch Wagner. Dr. Wagner was awarded one of the first doctorates in the country for work in women's studies and was a founder of one of the first college-level women's studies programs in the US. She has taught women's studies for 50 years and currently serves as an adjunct faculty member in the Syracuse University Renee Crown University Honors Program. She wrote the faculty guide for and appeared in Not for Ourselves Alone, which is the Ken Burns documentary about Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And she's appeared in a number of other history films and radio programs and television appearances. She's the founder and executive director of the Matilda Joslyn Gage Center for Social Justice Dialogue in Fayetteville, New York. And in just a few minutes while she's presenting, I'll post a link for that in the chat. I'll also post a link for her personal website, which is sallyreschwagner.com. She's a prolific author. One of her previous books includes Sisters in Spirit, Iroquois Influence on Early American Feminists. And her newest book, The Women's Suffrage Movement, is an anthology that unfolds a new intersectional look at the 19th century women's rights movement. And by the way, of course, you can purchase that book through the Missouri History Museum shop, and I will post a link for that as well, of course. And this evening, you'll get a great little sneak peek at this book if you haven't had the chance to purchase it for yourself already, as Dr. Wagner shares some of this complex history with us. And with that, I'm going to make myself scarce and turn the screen over to Dr. Wagner. Welcome this evening.
Oh.
Oops, I think I might have to turn your video back on. There we go. There we go.
Oh.
You're looking great. You're ready to go.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Emily. And I am really honored tonight to do this talk in the memory of Elizabeth and Kathy. The Missouri Historical Society has a wonderful place in my heart because some of the information that you'll be hearing tonight was gathered at the Missouri Historical Society Research Center, where I got wonderful assistance in 1975 when I was writing my dissertation at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Well, I want to begin, I think, with the typical narrative that we have of the women's suffrage movement. It was 1848, Seneca Falls Convention through to 1920, and the 19th Amendment It was Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony pretty much doing it by themselves. And it was all about the vote. Well, every single part of that narrative is wrong. I want to begin, first of all, with where history really begins on this land. I think we have the arrogance often as the settler colonists to think that history begins when we get here. That's the real history. Well, where I am right now on Onondaga territory, Onondaga is the center of the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois Confederacy. I'm on the Aboriginal homeland of the Onondaga Nation and 20 minutes away from where they are today. The Haudenosaunee women have had political voice on this land for 1,000 years while we're celebrating 100. Let me say a little bit more about that. The clan mothers are responsible for nominating, holding in position, and removing, if necessary, the men that represent them on the council, the Grand Council. The sachem or the chief, as they're referred to, is a balance of power. It's a balance of responsibility, they would say in their words. Power is more of a Western term indicating authority over. The clan mothers, it makes sense. These are the grandmas who raise the boys. They're living in a longhouse traditionally with their daughters, their husband, their daughters' husbands, their children, all of their grandchildren, and their unmarried sons. Once the sons marry, they go to live with their wives' longhouse. That still continues today a lot among the traditionals, that the men go to live in the community of their wives because the clan comes through the wife. Lineage is through the woman. I remember trying to explain to one of my Onondaga friends about illegitimacy, and she couldn't, it didn't compute. She couldn't get it through her mind. It was, well, how can a child be illegal? You always know who your mother is. And you do know who your mother is. And the women are the ones who watch these boys grow up, especially the clan mother. And she looks for the boy, not the one who puts himself forward or the one who is looking out for himself. She looks for the boy who is going to be looking out for the interests of everyone else, because the chief has to make decisions for the 7th generation to come. And he cannot make decisions that benefit him. He has to make them for the whole community. The clan mother is there to instruct him. She's there to keep him in line. She's there to keep him on the path. She chooses him with 3 rules that are absolute. I mean, if he's done any of these things, he will never be considered to be a chief. And if it's discovered he's done any of them, he'll be removed immediately. He cannot have committed a theft. He can't have taken anything. He can't committed a murder. He has to step down if he's a warrior. And he cannot have abused a woman or child. That's an absolute line that a man cannot cross. If he does, his clan mother will remove him immediately. The process generally is this. If he has done something that strays from the path, doing the will of the people, looking to the needs of the 7th generation, she gives him a warning once. If he doesn't come back on the path, then she gives him a 2nd warning. The 3rd time, she removes his horns. It's a symbol of authority that she holds, and she places it on the chief, and if necessary, removes it. When he passes, if he's continued as the chief, when he passes, the horns are given back to her, and she places them on the new. Elizabeth Cady Stanton thought that was incredible that the woman had that power. She talked about it as cutting off the horns. That's one way to describe it. In a speech to the National Council of Women in 1891, she talks about that. She also talks about divorce, Haudenosaunee style. She says, if the husband misbehaves in any way, he will just find his belongings outside the longhouse, and that's it. Now, this really resonated with her because she had been proposing that women should be able to leave loveless and dangerous marriages, and she was really criticized. She was a heretic for even suggesting that, because at the time, the prevailing Christian belief was that marriage was not a civil union between two people. It was actually a covenant with God, and you could not break a covenant with God. So she sees a divorce Indian style, native style, Haudenosaunee style. She writes also, talks about the superior position of indigenous women in a number of cultures, as does Matilda Joslyn Gage. Now, let me just quickly introduce Gage. Gage was equally important with Stanton and Anthony in the National Woman Suffrage Association. They shared leadership positions. The three of them edited the History of Women's Suffrage together. And they actually, Gage was a writer along with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, wrote most of the documents of the NWSA, but she was also an activist with Susan B. Anthony. Anthony couldn't write, Stanton didn't want to be an activist, Gage is a combination of the two. Matilda Joslyn Gage in 1875 is president of the National Woman Suffrage Association. And she writes a series of front page articles for the New York Evening Post. And the editor of the Post introduces them saying, it is only appropriate that the president of the suffrage movement writes about the superior position of Indian women, which indeed she proceeds to do. Now, in 1893, Matilda Joslyn Gage tries to vote for the position of school superintendent. It's still illegal in the state of New York, although they've won the right to vote for a school board for local election, but she pushes the envelope and tries to vote for a school superintendent, a state office, and she is arrested. She doesn't win the case. The same year, she is given an honorary adoption into the Wolf Clan of the Mohawk Nation. And she writes to her daughter and says, my clan sisters are talking about my having a position on the Council of Matrons, which would give me a say in the choosing of the chief. Consensus, everyone has a voice. And she is this suffrage leader, is considered for a political voice in 1893 in the nation that has, the clan and nation that has honorarily adopted her, given her a real clan name. She's considered for a political voice. Same year, she's arrested for voting in her own nation. I'll tell you one other story of the way in which the suffragists were influenced by the Haudenosaunee. And it's an illustrative story. It's sort of, I've found several examples of this from other women in other times, but this one's important because it's the International Council of Women in 1888. First time women are gathering nationally, well, internationally in the United States to talk about their position. Alice Fletcher, who's an early ethnographer and anthropologist, is talking about Native women, and she shares this story. She is with a group of Omaha women, women of the Omaha Nation, and one of the women gives away a horse, and she says, oh, hadn't you better check with your husband? And she said, the merriment with which my statement was made, these women are just laughing their heads off at me, and I've just forgotten for a moment that I'm with Native women who have the right to their own property. And this is endemic across indigenous nations. When it is against the law in most states, before the women's rights movement in the 19th century, it's against the law for women to own their own property once they marry. Women are considered dead in the law. They cease to exist once they are married. Now, it's not a matter of them not having rights, it's just that they had no legal existence. And how did that translate out in practice? Well, first of all, you of course had no right to your property. Anything you owned, anything, any possessions you had that you brought into the marriage or any that you developed while you were married became the property of your husband. You had no right to your children. A husband on his deathbed could will away a child. And when that child was born, if he's dead, the will is read, the child is taken from the mother and given to its rightful owner. A woman had no right to her body. She had no right to make decisions about reproduction. She had no right to be free from violence. A husband had the legal right to beat his wife into submission as long as he did not inflict permanent damage, because again, canon law or church law is the foundation for common law. And with the idea that the two become one, and from the story of Eve all the way to St. Paul in the New Testament, women are to obey their husbands. So if a wife dies in disobedience to her husband, she's going to go down below, and it's going to be his fault because he did not enforce obedience. Now, think of the twisted logic of this. If you really love your wife and she doesn't obey you, then you, if you truly love her and want her salvation, will beat her into submission. Whew, that's the basis for battering and wife battering. Husbands have the legal right to rape their wives. Rape laws read an act of unlawful sexual intercourse with someone other than the wife of the perpetrator. Those laws didn't get changed until the 1970s and 80s with the second wave of feminism. So you see the position of these women in the United States under US law, and the opposite was the case with Native women. And every chance, every time that non-Native women came in contact with Native women, the evidence that I'm finding, and I presented in the book, is that they saw that the idea that they were told that it was religiously necessary for them to be under the authority of men, and also biologically, because science told them that they were inferior both physically and mentally and needed to have a mighty oak for their clinging vine to have for support. So seeing the Haudenosaunee was absolutely, I think, critical. I want to jump next to the another possibility of our looking at the origins of the women's rights movement. Well, first of all, I should say this. Women voted in the colonies. Property was the qualification. If you had sufficient property, in some cases, women voted because they had enough property. They were widows, they were unmarried women. And actually, before the revolution, the laws were less strict. It was after the revolution that the states passed the laws making it illegal for women to vote, among other things. So women voted in the colonies, and Matilda Joslyn Gage wrote, "We're not asking for a new right, we're asking for the restitution of a right that our mothers had, our foremothers had." So the first organizing really by women was not the women's rights movement. It was the female anti-slavery societies. Now, these were separate from the general anti-slavery societies. Women organized on their own. First African-American women, Boston, I think was 1832. And then it becomes a national organization with a national convention in 1837. These are women organizing to, and in the process, what they're doing is they're finding their political voice. They are learning how to do petitions. They're learning how to speak in public. They're learning how to organize meetings. They're learning to fundraise, and they're learning to face down mobs. In the following year, 1838, they're meeting in Philadelphia, and the mob grows outside, and it's the what do they call them? Gentlemen of property and standing. It's not just ruffians. It's like the elite are furious at women organizing on their own, furious at women being anti-slavery. So they start threatening the women inside. And they start throwing rocks at the building, break some windows. Women finally are forced to leave. They make sure that every African-American woman is accompanied by a white woman, because they know that the Black women are most vulnerable. So you begin to have this incredible, powerful organization of women, Black and white. Then you have the Civil War, and the suffrage organization, it was actually just informal meetings every year. And they disband and work to end slavery. They say, we are not supporting the war effort, as Lincoln says we are doing, to preserve the Union. We will only support this war effort as long as it's fought to end slavery. And they gather 300,000 signatures, the largest number that's ever been gathered in the United States to that point. And they then, after slavery is abolished, they invite the anti-slavery organization to join with them, and together they'll work for universal suffrage. Well, the radical Republicans, as they were called, the progressive Republicans, looked at this. Initially, they said, yes, we will universal suffrage. It makes sense. You know, we've abolished slavery, the 3/5 of a person for the purpose of representation. So we should ensure that everybody's citizens with a vote. And then they get cold feet, and for a variety of reasons decide, nope, we're just going to give African-American men the right to vote. Well, there's a lot of breaking at that point. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony take money from a known racist, and their statements, their racist statements are absolutely unexcusable. They were then. Their co-workers called them out for the racism of their statements. But those were individual statements. I want to jump to 1890. When there are two organizations, and if I have time, I want to tell you one story that includes Lily Devereux Blake, who is a Missouri person. Her papers are in the Historical Society, and they are one of the treasures of suffrage history. But I'm going to jump to 1890 now and come back to that if we have time. If not, maybe in the question and answer. 1890, the two suffrage organizations that have formed after the 14th and 15th Amendment enfranchises African-American men. These two organizations are very different. The National is working for an amendment to the Constitution at the federal level to protect. The American is working state by state, states' rights, saying that states have the right to determine who should vote. You know, it's unclear at that point if it's the national, federal that determines voting qualifications or if it's the states. Well, states' rights at that point, think about it. What that's doing is to help the southern states that are trying to stop African-American men from voting in a whole variety of ways, including lynching, but also with voter restriction in a variety of ways. And because if you can give women the right to vote by a state, can't that state also take it away from African-American men? I mean, it could challenge the Constitution and the amendment. But the two organizations also are very different in terms of how they conduct their activities. The American, well, I'll give you an example. The American 1876 has a tea party to celebrate the centennial of the United States. The National Women's Suffrage Association, Stanton and Gage, pen a Declaration of Rights of Women. Gage and Anthony illegally present it at the July 4th celebration. They're denied the right to do it. They do it anyway. And Gage writes, we made the presentation not for the women of our time, but for the daughters of 1976, so they would know that their daughters or their mothers of 1876 had impeached the government for its treatment of women. So they work in very, very different ways. But Anthony thinks we need to focus on the vote, just the vote. Let's get the vote, and then we can deal with all these other issues later. Well, they're dealing at this point, the National especially, and the most progressive women in the suffrage movement they've been working for equal pay for equal work since the 1850s. They're working for reproductive rights. They're working for an end to violence against women. They're working for job equity in all its ways. I mean, they're working for property rights for women. They're working on all the issues. But Anthony wants just the focus on the vote. So what she does is to really engineer a merger between the National and the American. And the Blake collection is really one of the places where I found a lot of evidence of this. So she engineers a merger between the National and the American. It's really a takeover of by the American. And it brings in the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Now, they're 10 times stronger than the suffrage movement. This is an organized body of mother love for God, home, and heaven. They want to outlaw tobacco and liquor in the United States, but they also want to put God in the Constitution, prayer in the public schools, and set Jesus Christ up as the head of government. And of course, it will be the conservative Christians that determine what Jesus or God wants. You know, given that there's not a whole lot of instruction that is absolute, and Christians are pretty much divided about a lot of the critical issues, and have been since the abolition movement, people on both sides arguing that Christianity either condoned slavery or opposed slavery, that the Bible did. So Gage sees this as the great danger of the hour, and she drops out of the movement. She says, if we lose religious rights, if we lose what our founding fathers said was the foundation of all freedoms, the right to be free of religion, as well as practicing whatever religion you want, but keeping that wall of separation between church and state, the WCTU, which now outnumbers the women's suffrage movement, but is part of it, incorporated into it, wants to destroy that wall. Gage drops out of the movement. She says, this is the end of the women's rights movement. It's been destroyed. What she is pointing to and what happens is that the movement becomes increasingly conservative, and toward the end, it decides that we've got to court the South. We've got to get the southern states to allow women to vote, to pass the amendment. And they allow the National American Women's Suffrage Association, the new organization, allows the states absolute autonomy because it's a states' rights organization. So the state auxiliaries are allowed to segregate, they're allowed to work for the vote for white women only, and they're allowed to work for voter suppression laws. And some of the auxiliaries do all three of those. African American women are not allowed into the NAWSA conventions if their skin is dark and they're visibly African American. Women who can pass slip into the convention. 1895, Susan B. Anthony says to Frederick Douglass, please don't come to the convention. We're meeting in Atlanta. 1890 or 1900, his widow, he dies in 1895. His widow in 1900 writes a letter to a friend and says, the colored women do not like Miss Anthony. She said, I sat through the convention, the NAWSA convention, and heard a Southern delegate 3 times call for white supremacy. And Anthony, the president, never once interfered, never stopped it. The policy of the National American Woman Suffrage Association actually becomes racism. They make this argument, give women the vote because it's a way to maintain white supremacy. And it's also a way to maintain native-born supremacy. Why? Because white women outnumber Negroes, men and women, and outnumber immigrants, men and women. So if you want to maintain white supremacy, if you want to work against immigrants, give us the vote. So African American women organize on their own. They've been part of the national and the American. I'll point out one, Mary Ann Shadd Cary, incredible woman, first African American woman to publish a newspaper in North America. She has fled to Canada after the Fugitive Slave Act, and she is a teacher up there for a while, and then she edits a newspaper. When the war begins, she comes back to the States and she becomes an army recruiter, recruiting Negro African-American men as soldiers. After the war, she gets her law degree. She becomes involved in the women's rights movement, the National Women's Suffrage Association. She's just one example. But after 1890, increasingly, African-American women are not allowed in to the organized women's suffrage movement. They then organize on their own, and they organize not just for women's suffrage. They organize for the issues that they have, and it's a multiplicity of issues. They work against lynching. They work for the education, the empowerment of African-American women in a whole variety of ways. And they practice a strategic political sophistication that really is worthwhile studying, because instead of turning their back on the suffrage movement, which has turned its back on them, they find ways to work for suffrage and to not create a deeper rift. I deeply, deeply admire and respect what they did. And it's the other side of it for me is that as someone who loves these women, I mean, I've been studying them for 50 years. I've been teaching about them. You know, I know their families. I also am critical of them because they won the battle to get us the vote, but they lost the war for freedom. And what they did in that process was that they allowed, instead of fighting against voter suppression, they allowed it, and they also actually worked for it. Elizabeth Cady Stanton's final speech of her life at the National American Women's Suffrage Association convention was a call for educated suffrage, which was, you know, it's a dog whistle for African Americans. It was illegal for them to learn to read and write. And also immigrants, when they came in, didn't always speak English. So instead of saying we need to expand the ballot, you know, to different languages, we need to work so African Americans can vote, she said no, they should not vote. So I think about where would we be today if they had made different decisions? How many lives of African American men and women might have been saved from lynching if we had joined, if the suffrage movement had joined Ida B. Wells' work to end lynching? Where would we be today if the voices of African Americans, men and women, hadn't been silenced for 50 years? African Americans really didn't get the vote until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 overruled some of the voter suppression laws. We're still fighting that battle today. I mean, it's gotten worse. The Supreme Court has knocked out some of those guarantees of the vote, and we see voter suppression everywhere going on today as we come up to the 2020 election. So I think it's, we're learning, I think, in this historic moment that history and those idols that we have, it's not either or. It's both and. They are both to be respected and thanked, and they are also to be criticized, because if we don't criticize them, if we don't learn from what they did wrong, we know what's going to happen. We're going to repeat it. So it's a moment really of atonement, I think, in 2020. It's a moment when we have a chance to evaluate our past and to honestly and truthfully take accountability for the racism that was at the heart of the later women's suffrage movement. So I think on that note, I may end it. I didn't get to the Blake story. If somebody asks for it, I would be really delighted to tell it.
Oh, thank you so much, Sally. That was so enlightening. And we will try to get to the Blake story, but I do have a few questions that I wanted
Great.
to send your way first.
Great.
I have someone asking if you could please explain why women were more successful in gaining voting rights in the Western states versus Eastern and Southern states.
Yeah. Well, I think I grew up in South Dakota, and in South Dakota in the 1880s, a third of the land was owned by women. One of the few examples of absence of inequality in law was the Homestead Act, passed during the Civil War. And it meant that anybody, man or woman, who would live on the land for 5 years, there were also other ways you could do it, but you would get that land. It was land that had been taken from the native inhabitants. You could get 160 acres. Now, if you were a widow, you could come with your children and you would have land. If you were a single woman, you could come. In fact, there were young girls who came together and homesteaded. They would build their, you had to have a house, a sod house or a shanty or something to live in, and they would build theirs together. They would build theirs on adjoining land. Their land came together and they lived together. Husbands and wives did the same thing, husbands and wives both getting land. So you had women who had economic independence. The other thing is that these were all territories at first, and territories can't vote for federal offices. So, you have Wyoming in 1969 is the very first. That was a territory. And I think it was both that the women were equally involved in the settlement of these communities in absolutely critical ways. So they had an empowerment that was different. It also was that your voting was limited, In 1883, if I remember right, it may have been 1885, the Dakota Territory legislature passed woman suffrage. The governor, who was a federal appointee of the president, vetoed it. Similar thing happened in Nebraska. So I think it's not at all chance that it was the Western states and the Midwestern states that came on board first.
Question two, and you addressed this a little bit when you were talking about um, also immigrants not being allowed to vote, but I am curious about the role that Asian and Latina women may have played. I know we talk a lot about in terms of black and white, and you also really strongly address the Native influence, but where do Asian and Latina women fit into this picture?
You know, this is really, this is new research to me. You know, when you write a book, it becomes obsolete the minute it goes to press. And I really concentrated on Native women and African American women. There has been extraordinary research this year, and I refer everybody to a New York Times book. In fact, I could just about jump up and run over and get it. But the New York Times has really done an extraordinary job of naming some of these women. I know they're Mary Baird called it this: we're repopulating history. She was an historian quite a few years ago, and I think that's the process that's going on. So you caught me with my education pants down there. I'm in the process of studying it, and I am not on the top of it enough to really name names and tell stories. But there are others who are in this moment, and I appreciate that question because that's the direction that I'm working in now. So the update of the book, when it comes out, will have. The other thing is that there were lesbians involved in the women's rights movement, and we're now writing them in. And I'll tell you one, Phoebe Hannaford was a minister who officiated at the funerals of both Stanton and Anthony, and she had a lifetime female partner, and her parishioners knew that she was a lesbian. Before Freud, it was pretty commonly accepted that women would have Boston marriages. If they had sufficient economic independence, number of women involved in the women's rights movement lived together. Presidents, two of the presidents, Carrie Chapman Catt and Anna Howard Shaw, it just goes on and on. So that's the repopulating of history. And the importance of it is, you know, if you're a high school lesbian and you're studying the women's suffrage movement, but you don't see yourself in it, you know, if you leave voices out of history, we don't know who we are, and we don't have a past, and we don't have anything to look to from the past. I think the biggest message for me is history is not what happened. It's who tells the story. And when you only have, as I had when I was growing up, the rich white male story, you got wars, you got dates unrelated, you got iconic male figures. That is not how history is made. History is made by movements. It's not made by individuals. Abraham Lincoln did not free the slaves. Abraham Lincoln finally responded reluctantly to the anti-slavery movement.
You know, something you said brings me to another question I've been thinking about, because you mentioned high schoolers learning about this, and I'm thinking even about younger students learning. And, you know, I guess aside from reading your book and reading all of these wonderful documents and sources that we have for this information, how do you think schools can better teach this story and teach a more complex story, even just about Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and a more complex story about the movement in general?
Change the nature and the people that are on the Texas school board. That's the biggest thing that can happen, because they're huge purchasers of textbooks, and they have gutted the Texas school board. State school board has gutted the story of social justice movements in textbooks. And, you know, if they're not going to buy the textbooks, the producers or the publishers are not going to tell the story that Texas won't buy. And so, it starts really with political activism and taking control of the stories that our students get. I guess this is a little self-serving, but behind me, I have my newest book, which is so new that I didn't even send it to you in my bio. This is, and this is what's happening. I guess I could just give this as an example. We Want Equal Rights. It's a story for high school students about the Native influence, the indigenous influence on the women's rights movement. And I did it because there was so much request for it. It was, I did Sisters in Spirit, the Haudenosaunee influence, but it was really for adults. So I think that there are a number of us that are now writing books, sort of compensatory education, if you will, that will give high school students, and the teachers are going to need to search for them.
And what you just keep segueing perfectly to the next questions that I have for you.
Great.
I did want to go back to the stuff you were talking about very early on about the Iroquois influence on the suffrage movement and on the concept of feminism and the women's movement. So I guess I want to know how you see that fading from memory, because I think that influence was something a lot of people don't know about, and I'm curious if that was something that was being written out of the story by Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Were they crediting these women? How did that go?
I started asking that question probably is in the 1980s. I got a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship, and that was when I saw the connection. Gage writes about it. She says, never was justice more perfect, never was civilization higher. And she's referring to indigenous nations, and specifically the Haudenosaunee. How could that story have gotten lost? Well, Gage was deliberately written out of the history. Susan B. Anthony lived longer than Gage and Stanton. She is the editor with her hand-picked biographer of the last 3 volumes of the history of women's suffrage. And, as the movement was appealing to racism, do you think they wanted it to be remembered that Native women, that's sort of gonna, and they didn't want Gage with her very progressive ideas. Gage in 1893 exposed that Catholic priests are sexually abusing children and women. She also exposes sex trafficking being practiced in the United States. I mean, this is a woman, Gloria Steinem says, this is the woman who is ahead of the women who are ahead of their time. And so I think repopulating history with these women, like Lily Devereaux Blake, like Virginia Minor, and the male allies like Frances Minor, who brings the test case to the Supreme Court to decide whether or not women can vote in 1875. And it comes up with the strategy. We can vote under the 14th Amendment. That becomes then the National Woman Suffrage Association approach. It's like the women who are voting and being arrested or, not being allowed to vote, they make the argument, wait a minute, we're not the lawbreakers. The federal government is the lawbreaker in not protecting us in our right to the ballot. We're citizens, we have the right. And Frances Minor, because Virginia Minor, his wife, both from St. Louis, not allowed to sue and be sued because she's a married woman, he takes the case to the Supreme Court. And Supreme Court says, 9 white men, if there is any case that can be said to be settled now and forever, it is this one. Women do not have the right to vote guaranteed in the United States of America. The Minors really need to be written back into history. They are principally in my book. Yeah.
And in the Beyond the Ballot exhibit, I'll add,
I so long to see it. Is it online?
It's not, but it will be open for quite some time. So hopefully you'll be able to come see it when we're all able to do that kind of thing again and
And
travel
I
more for that
so
again.
wanted to get back in the archive. I have a very compromised immune system, so I'm staying in place until it's
We
safe.
want you to stay healthy. It sounds like you have a lot more writing to do and educating of us to do. So stay healthy. Keep doing that. Um, I wanted to ask. Well, actually, I have a ton of questions to ask you, but I think I want to give you a chance to tell your story about Lily Devereaux Blake. So why don't we take a moment to learn about her?
You know, another way the history would have been different is in 1900. No, it wasn't. It was later than that. When was it? Oh, I should have this date right at my fingertips, and I don't. But it was when Anthony was stepping down, probably 1902. I think Anthony was stepping down as president. And Lily Devereaux Blake had Stanton's support. She had the support of a number of people to be president of the National American Woman Suffrage Association. Now, she was really working on legislation. The legislative committee, Anthony gutted it. And Anthony, 2 weeks before the convention, announced her hand-picked successor. Gee, that sounds a little bit like a dictatorship, not a democratic organization. Blake drops out of the presidency, out of the race, because she doesn't want there to be the conflict. And she goes on to form her own organization. That doesn't last long. But the story I want to tell is in 1886, she's in New York City, president of the New York City Woman Suffrage Association. And Lady Liberty goes up in the harbor, Statue of Liberty. And the New York City Woman Suffrage Association rents a boat and with banners flying protests against the unveiling of the Statue of Liberty, calling it the greatest hypocrisy that liberty is represented as a woman in a nation where not a single woman has political liberty. I love Blake's economics were this. She says, okay, we should do this, shouldn't we? How much money do we have in the treasury? I think it's $26. How much will it cost to rent a boat? 100. Great, we'll do it. And she found the money. They found the money. They did it.
I love that. All the stories of women who just make things happen, right? By hook or by crook, you can just make it happen. We are getting close to the end of our time. I did just want to ask very quickly just about your process for putting this book together. How on earth did you choose and organize all of these incredible historical documents? And I guess a follow-up to that is, you know, if I'm organizing a book club or something like that, how do you suggest people best use your book as a tool? Do they read it straight through in chronological order? Is it better to find a couple of pieces to contrast? What do you recommend?
Well, what I would really recommend is this. First of all, the process. It's like, I mean, I've been studying this stuff since 1973, actually. So I went to my files. The other thing is that a lot of materials that when I first started my research, it took me months to get them because I would get them through interlibrary loan, you know, and it would start the search, the closest libraries, and then expand. Some of the materials I got for my dissertation in the 1970s were from the Library of Congress. You know, the last stage, the only copy that was available was there. That stuff, much of it is now online. It's a miracle world. So it was a combination of those two. But how to choose? there were three stories that I wanted to do, three things. One was that I didn't want it to start with white women. I wanted to look at all the other issues that the women were dealing with, and I wanted to really call out the racism. And that was the real structure. And then within that, what are the stories that empower me? What are the stories that make me mad, that make me excited, that make me want to change the world? Those are the stories I chose. I'm an activist. I've been a radical feminist since the 1969. And so I look at the world through the eyes of an activist. How do we inspire people to change the world? And that was really that's what stands out for me. That's what I see when I look at these documents. In terms of reading it, my sister had the best suggestion. She said, read the introductions first, all the introductions, and then go back and pick up the ones that really grab you, the original documents that you really want to use. I'm hoping that people will use those original documents to create plays, to create, readings, to use them in all kinds of ways. I wanted people to have the voices of their foremothers and forefathers.
Well, there you have it, folks. You can take the directions of Sally Rush Wagner and go get the book and start your book club and write your plays and bring those words to life. I love that.
Oh, let me suggest something. If anybody does a book club, I would love to visit with them, do a Zoom with them, because that would really help me to get a sense of what works for people, what doesn't for the rewriting. You always are looking to the second edition, especially with Penguin Classics. They're out forever.
If somebody's interested in doing that, they can reach you via your website, right?
Yes.
We have that link posted here, the sallyrushwagner.com.
Yep.
And we are about out of time. And Sally, this has just been such a treat. And thank you so much for being here tonight. If everyone will just bear with me for one moment, I'm going to share my screen. Excuse me. Just give me 1 second, because I want to make sure that you can see some of our upcoming programs. And I also want to once again acknowledge all of the wonderful sponsors of our Beyond the Ballot exhibit, including Wells Fargo and Emerson and the Women's Foundation of Greater St. Louis. There we go. Now it's finally sharing correctly. So thank you to all of those sponsors. Thank you to all of you for tuning in tonight. If you're interested in more of this kind of programming, learning about the women's suffrage movement, about the stories of inclusion or the lack thereof, I have a couple of programs that are coming up right around the corner that I want to recommend to you. So this coming Sunday on September 13th, we are going to be joined by Dr. Carolyn Jefferson Jenkins. She's the first African-American president of the National League of Women Voters, and she's going to speak about her book, The Untold Story of Women of Color in the League of Women Voters. And that's presented with the local League of Women Voters of Metro St. Louis. And then just the following day, on Monday, September 14th, we'll have Dr. Leanne Gidlow with us, and she's going to speak on Suffrage at 100, Women's Rights, Civil Rights, and Voting Rights from 1920 to COVID-19. That's presented with the University of Missouri St. Louis as part of their annual Prim Lecture. Both of those start at 7 p.m. You can find links to those and all of our upcoming programs on our website, mohistory.org. You can also find it on the Facebook page for the Missouri Historical Society. So please be sure to check those out. And again, don't forget to fill out the survey that pops up in your browser. And thank you again so much for joining us virtually this evening. We hope to see you again soon. Thank you so much. Have a great night.